Good evening. Our top story tonight, Rashee Rice surrenders himself to the police and posts a $40,000 bond in relation to the crash that occurred a few weeks ago where multiple people were injured and where he was in ownership of both a Lamborghini and a Corvette that led to a multiple car pileup. The situation, we're continuing to learn more and more as the weeks go on, and unfortunately, it's not looking good for him. There have been 8 felony charges, I guess, set up against him at this point right now. Or 8, he's facing 8 felony charges, for lack of a better term. But none of them are including him leaving the site of the collision. So let's just kind of overview what we're looking at here. So he's facing 1 count of aggravated assault, 1 count of collision involving serious bodily injury, and then 6 counts of collision involving injury. So what we know, there were up to 6 or so people involved in the crash outside of the ones driving the 2 cars who caused all of this mayhem. And there were no serious injuries, at least from what we know, but that still doesn't matter as it relates to this charges. And I'm not a lawyer, but this does not look great, especially with the fact that one of the worst parts to me was the fact that he left the scene and didn't really see if anyone was injured or not. So I do think because of those pending charges and because of the charges, like these felony charges that he's facing right now, we're definitely going to be looking at some level of a suspension for Rasheed Rice. I don't know if it's going to be this year. Things are actually moving kind of quick, so I wouldn't be surprised if it happened this year. But either this year or next year, you will be missing Rasheed Rice for multiple games, possibly indefinitely. You don't know. I don't think that's going to happen, but you got to keep an eye on it. So we're going to be talking about a lot more about what we think is going to happen with Rasheed Rice, what we may predict may be the suspension and the impact from a fantasy perspective. And then there's just a ton of other news as it relates to the receiver landscape. There's a lot of contract news involving the biggest names like CeeDee Lamb, Brandon Aiyuk, T. Higgins, Devonte Adams. So we're going to talk about all that and more on Player Profiler today. All right, so as we had just mentioned, Rasheed Rice, he was part of the group that created the collision that occurred in Dallas a few weeks ago, leading to multiple injuries. And we now have police reports saying that he was going up to 119 miles per hour just seconds before that really serious collision happened. He, unlike what was originally reported, like the day of the crash, he was driving the Lamborghini, not the Corvette, but he did happen to own both of the vehicles. The interesting thing there is, it apparently was with some of his friends, clearly. One of the other guys, the other driver of the Corvette, his name is Teddy Knox. So he's 21 years old. He was actually a current SMU Mustang, so former Rasheed Rice teammate. He was a cornerback for the SMU Mustangs this season. But he's actually been suspended by the SMU football team. I don't know for how long. I could not find that. But it does seem like they took really immediate action to deal with the fact that Teddy Knox was involved in this crash. And I do think it's pretty clear we're going to see some level of suspension for Rasheed Rice. This is the hardest part about trying to figure out what's going to happen is the lack of direct precedent. There's precedents for assault. There's precedent for vehicular, I guess, suspendable offenses, but not too many of the what you would call a hit and run situation. So I do think what would ratchet up this versus what we've seen from a vehicular standpoint, from what we saw with Chris Olave or Jordan Addison, where they got in trouble with the law, but there was no injuries outside of themselves, and they weren't really injured in these situations. But I mean, they were going multiple factors over the speed limit. I think the thing that makes this different than those situations is the injuries involved. And so I'm just trying to look for some level of precedent. I just went and researched some of the assault related suspensions that we've seen in the NFL and ones that did not relate to domestic assault. And apparently, I mean, there were just so many domestic violence ones I had to sift through. But these are just assault allegations, not technically domestic, and basically none of them dealing with vehicular except for one. All right, so in 2007, Jeremy Bridges, he was an offensive guard for the Carolina Panthers. He was suspended 2 games for misdemeanor assault charges. In 2008, Vikings offensive line Bryant McKinney, he was suspended 4 games, and he was arrested for aggravated battery charges. It was relation to a brawl outside of a nightclub. He was suspended for 4 games. We obviously remember Alvin Kamara. I think it was last year. He was suspended this past season for something that happened the year before, where him and a few other NFL players got into a fight with this. They basically jumped this guy at the Pro Bowl the year prior. And so he was suspended for 3 games for that. And then we all remember Kareem Hunt. We saw the video. He was suspended 8 games for the assault video caught on tape where he kicked the young lady in that grainy hotel footage. So it's hard to understand kind of like where this all sits from a suspension standpoint of what we should predict. The closest one that I saw, but it's still, you're still making a lot of leaps and bounds to try to relate this to Rasheed Rice, is the Derek Coleman incident that happened, I believe it was like in 2015, 2016. He was a former Seahawks fullback, and he was a guy who he's fully deaf. He plays with hearing aids. He was a fullback. He played for Seattle, and then after that, he played for Atlanta and a few other teams. Relatively short career. And again, he was a fullback, so not super impactful. He wasn't Mike Allstott or anything. But this situation is closest that I found to the Rasheed Rice thing. So he was found to have been using like something called Spice. It was like a synthetic marijuana. He may have been under the influence. He ended up getting into a pretty serious crash. His car flipped on its side. The owner of the other car he hit completely flipped over. And the 56-year-old man in the car that he hit suffered a broken collarbone. So, you're thinking about vehicular situation involving injury to somebody else, like rather serious injury. And so from a legal standpoint, Derek Coleman pled guilty. He had to do, he did no jail time. He only did 240 hours. He did 240 hours of community service, and he had to serve like a 1-year community supervision statute. And from an NFL perspective, he was initially suspended indefinitely, and then it got pulled back to 4 games. But I just don't think that, he was a fullback. He wasn't super impactful. He never played for the Seahawks again, ended up getting picked up like a year or so later after he had kind of gone through all of his community service and things like that. So I don't know, the biggest difference to these guys to me is just the impact of the player. Rasheed Rice is not Derek Coleman. So even if he was suspended, there's not a situation where he's not going to play a full year if he's able to play. I would not be surprised. And again, this prediction I'm about to tell you are my personal views. They do not relate to any news I've seen, and they also do not relate to Player Profiler and any of their thoughts, Roto Underworld, any of that stuff. I just want to say that up top. But I would predict that I'm still thinking he's going to be in the 3 to 4 game range. I would not be surprised if his suspension is initially higher. Like, what if they may give him like a 6-game suspension off the rip, right? I don't think he's going to get an indefinite suspension because of his cooperation so far. But I could easily see the NFLPA appeal that down to 3. And so that's why I feel like 3 to 4 still feels like a relevant number to me. So that's kind of what I'm sticking with until we get more information. So you guys are going to want to make sure you stay tuned to understand what's happening next in this case and not just having me speculate around the suspension we're going to see, because obviously if he's going to be suspended for even like 3 to 4 games, massive impact on the Chiefs, massive impact on his fantasy value. You've already seen his ADP really start to come down. I'm still buying his ADP until I see a suspension, and I think that's really strong advice to do the same. But we don't know, and we got to stay tuned. So make sure you guys stay tuned with us, and we're going to talk about a lot more news from the wide receiver market on the other side of this break.
This episode is brought to you by Player Profiler, the Dynasty Deluxe package. The rankings are the best in the industry. It includes strategy mode where you can say, hey, change the rankings to be win now. Oh, change the rankings to be productive struggle. There's also a draft planner to help you strategize where you should take players, because the draft planner also includes ADP. There's a trade finder where we look up on My Fantasy League and we see trades that are done, including a particular player. Then there's a trade analyzer where you can plug in draft picks, players, and we assign a lifetime value to draft picks out 5 years. The best thing about our trade analyzer, it can't be gamed with volume. And there's mock draft data to see right now what's the market for player X versus player Y, including in the fall when very few mock drafts are happening. And our Dynasty Guide, the Dynasty Dominator, would cost you $10 on Amazon, but you get it for free with Dynasty Deluxe, and you get our Rookie Guide for free, a $25 value. So you get all of that for $45. I mean, it's a great deal.
It is a great deal. Make sure you guys tap into that tool, but also make sure you guys are subscribing to all of our products, especially make sure you guys subscribe to us on YouTube here, subscribe to the main page, Player Profiler on YouTube. We're giving you this content every day. This show runs daily every single day at 7, and we want to make sure that we get you the latest news that is relevant to you to help you win your league. So make sure you guys are tapped in, because the people who are not winning their leagues are not paying attention right now, but the reason you're paying attention is to give you that next advantage. So make sure you guys stay tuned. All right, so moving on, next receiver, no legal issues here. But all right, so it seems like Brandon Aiyuk's agent, Ryan Williams, denied that his client has requested a trade from the 49ers. So that kind of like goes against what we had thought this entire offseason, that Brandon Aiyuk was like really ardently requesting a trade. And it's very possible that he did. It just never got reported. But all signs are pointing that he's going to just re-sign with the 49ers. The 49ers said last month that they've been talking about a new deal rather than looking for a trade partner. If you really think of it, a lot of the rumors around Brandon Aiyuk have been involving the other team looking for Brandon Aiyuk versus the 49ers being the ones shopping him about. So I don't know if the 49ers resolve has changed at all as it relates to Brandon Aiyuk. I mean, he's an amazing player, 1,300-yard receiver, and a critical part of that offense that everyone understands, especially in that building. Now, we did see kind of like the tried and true method very recently of him unfollowing the 49ers on social media. I believe it was on Instagram where he unfollowed them. But the one thing you always got to remember is a lot of times when a player unfollows someone on social media, that may be more reflective of how the player feels. Clearly, it's their social media, than how the progress of discussions are going. Now, clearly, he wants to just be re-signed today, but I'm still really stuck on him just re-signing with the 49ers. I really want him to sign with somebody else if he's going to continue to get peppered with targets and be appreciated in that offense. And to me, the Bills will be the cream of the crop location, especially now that Diggs is out of there. But if I was going to give you a prediction, it's a more than 50% chance in my eyes that he's going to re-sign with the 49ers. Now, I know there's a lot of people concerned about like their cap space, and they technically on the books don't have a ton of cap room. But here's what you got to think about. So, yes, so Aiyuk, Kittle, and Debo, Christian McCaffrey, and Kittle, they're going to account for, I think, like $55 million in cap space this coming year, 2024. And so you could think, like, how is Aiyuk going to factor into that? Many reasons. So, one, Eric Armstead is out of the building now. That's actually freeing up $18 million in cap space. You got to consider that when you're talking about an extension for Aiyuk. Two, the biggest thing, your quarterback's making $1 million this year. That's how you can extend a player like a Brandon Aiyuk. That is the definition of why you got to hit on quarterback and hit on them quickly so that you could load up that team with talent. And this is a perfect example of that, where your quarterback who's been playing at an elite level is only getting $1 million a year. And then the last thing you got to think about it, they picked up Brandon Aiyuk's fifth-year option. He's going to be making $14 million this year. Honestly, if he gets an extension, that number's probably going to come down this year. And then some of that incentive is obviously going to be spread over the years of this new deal that he's seeking to get. So from a cap standpoint, even though a lot of people are freaking out because they have so many talented players, it's really not that big of a deal. And I think the Eric Armstead move was really slept on potentially creating room for Brandon Aiyuk. I'm actually starting to move into the camp of thinking that they're going to get this deal done before the season starts. And then they're going to have their same offense like they had last year. So that's what I think is going to happen with Brandon Aiyuk. Sorry about that. All right. Next story, and it relates to CeeDee Lamb. So it does seem like voluntary workouts in the offseason program for a lot of teams technically starts tomorrow, April 15th. And it does seem like CeeDee Lamb is not going to be attending those for the Cowboys. Now, they are voluntary, so I get it. We shouldn't – I don't know. Why are you guys reporting on a voluntary workout? I do think that this is indicative of how the talks are going. And I do think that we need to be paying attention to any news like this for a player who's going to be – he may be drafted number 1 overall in some league formats. It is a really big deal that the talks have been getting stalled out so much for a player who's done so much over the last few years for that Cowboys team. And it really does just speak to the idea that, while, yes, I think that the voluntary workout is not a big deal. I think his name is, Michael Gelkin. I'm going to mess up his name, from the Dallas Morning News. He does think that this may lead into, some of the involuntary workouts starting to get missed and some of the other offseason program, not attending those. That's a big deal. If you're not going to have CeeDee Lamb for some of those situations, I think that's where it's going to start to get scary. And as we get closer and closer and closer to training camp, if CeeDee Lamb is not a part of the Cowboys workouts, it's going to get really scary if you're going to be drafting him. Again, there are some people who are drafting him number 1 overall. I'm not doing that, but he is my number 1 receiver right now. And this is the type of news that's going to make him move down my rankings behind Tyreek Hill and others. He has been just absolutely dominant the last few years, and especially this season. So on the second half of the season, he was doing terrible until he had that heart-to-heart with Mike McCarthy. And then for the last seven of the last 11 weeks, he was a top 10 wide receiver or better in PPR. And a lot of times he was like the wide receiver 1 or 2 or 3. His total season, he was 135 on 181 targets, which is nuts. 1,700 yards, 12 touchdowns, and 2 rushing touchdowns too. He is the biggest, most important piece of that offense. And the fact that he's still just kind of waving in the wind is really concerning, especially since it's not just him waving in the wind right now for Dallas. This is a fantasy, usually fantasy news related, but Michael Parsons, we heard the stories about apparently some unknown sources inside the building are saying they're kind of sick of his antics and stuff, Michael Parsons. And then the fact that they got to sign Parsons, Lamb, and they still got to re-sign Dak. Though that's really what's getting people really concerned, especially from a Dallas standpoint. You have so many big name parts of your team, like the actual, literally the 3 most important players on your team right now, probably outside of like some of your offensive linemen. You don't have long-term deals and long-term answers for them. That's really concerning if you're a Cowboys fan, because that's the core of your team and you need them to be aligned as you prepare for this next season. And I know that a lot of fans are also sick of the fact that they just haven't really done anything in free agency, and they've honestly let a lot of their good defensive players and other players walk. It's a good reason to be concerned if you're a Cowboys fan, especially with how the season ended last year. So I'm going to hold out on moving CeeDee Lamb out of my wide receiver 1 ranking. But as we get into the summer, that's definitely going to change if he's still not showing up in Arlington. All right, the next story just came out. So Devonte Adams said Sunday at his youth football camp that he intends to play for the Raiders next season. And again, this is what we expected this. I don't think too many people were expecting him not to be on the Raiders next year. But there were some trade rumors that were happening a few months ago around potentially the Raiders potentially moving off of Devonte Adams. But it at least seems like with his comments directly, with the fact that the GM, Tom Telesco, said that is absolutely not happening around a month ago, he said that. I think that Devonte Adams is going to be, I was about to say Oakland, a Las Vegas Raider at least for the next year. And I do think that Devonte Adams is one of the hardest players to rank this offseason. If you look at his play and his metrics, he's still really solid. Like another consecutive 1,000-yard season, I believe it's his 4th in a row. He continues to produce. The thing that sucks for him is this, we all know, it's this quarterback play. Aiden O'Connell last year, he just wasn't it. Jimmy G, we all knew what was happening before the season started last year. It just was not going to be the same with the Jimmy G, and then obviously with O'Connell stepping in there. So he really needs an uptick on that, because this was his worst yardage and touchdown season since 2019. And honestly, in 2019, he missed 4 games with a toe injury, I believe. So it hasn't been hasn't been his fault, but his production has really, really, really tailed off because of the quarterback play. So what's the plan there? Now, there are some rumors that the Raiders are looking for a quarterback, but there's some rumors that Antonio Pierce is really desperate to move up in the draft, whereas the Tom Telesco, the GM, he really wants to proceed with Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell. Now, I could see a world where Telesco's probably like, hey, Antonio Pierce, why don't you shut up a little bit, because you're ruining our leverage to try to move up, because you keep saying we want to move up. I could easily see a world like that where they actually do want to move up, but they just don't want to tell the world about it ahead of time. So maybe they still need to get a line, because maybe that story will quiet down in the next few weeks. But it does seem like the Raiders have strong interest to move up in this draft. I'm just trying to figure out who they're going to go get, because unless they gotta sell, they gotta just give up the entire franchise, multiple first round picks. They're not getting one, And I think the only place where you maybe can move somebody is off of 2, but it doesn't seem like Washington's super interested. Washington's listening to any talk, like anyone's going to call them, they're going to pick up the phone and listen. But they literally said, you have to give us the earth and the moon for us to move off the number 2 pick. And I do believe it's pretty locked in that the number 2 pick is going to be Jaden Daniels. Based on what Antonio Pierce has said this offseason, he does want a runner. And I think that there's some options outside of those first 2 guys who can run the ball really well. I just don't know how much you're going to give up to go get a Drake May, who's an underrated runner. JJ McCarthy, same thing, underrated runner, but very good quarterbacks, just really young and raw. Those 2 actually would fit as it relates to, like, you just let Gardner Minshew start as long as he wants, and then you let those guys come up as you need to. I just don't know how much people are going to, like, sell the farm to go get either one of those quarterbacks, and especially this Raiders team. I just can't see that for those 2 in particular. The one to me that would make sense, and they probably could stay where they're at and take them, and it would probably be considered high. And this may be selfish from a fantasy standpoint, I love the idea of Michael Penix there. I absolutely love it. I think that would be amazing for Devonte Adams. I would love it. I would absolutely love that fit. But the thing with Antonio Pierce, the fact that he even said he wanted a runner, I would hate that for Michael Penix. Because if I have Michael Penix, I know he ran that 4.5, super impressive. I am not running that man. Like he had 4 season-ending injuries in a row to start his career. Like, I'm just not going to run this guy. So that would be my only fear if the Raiders got him. But if they committed to, like, running the ball with Zamir White and then letting Penix just throw it all over the yard, I think Devonte Adams would have a stellar season. That would be, clearly the best receiver he's ever played with. This would be phenomenal for Devonte Adams, and Michael Penix would just sling it all over the yard. So I'd love that. But it's not going to happen. I feel like the Raiders are probably going to stay put. All right. Next bit of news, taking a divergence away from the wide receivers for just a quick second. All right, so Nick Chubb, it happened a few days ago, but he agreed to a restructure contract, lowering his $11.75 million base salary. I think, did he lower it to that? I think he significantly lowered his base salary. I believe he was going to be making like $15 million against the cap, and he significantly lowered that for like a quote-unquote team-friendly deal. We all remember when he got injured on Monday night against Pittsburgh, he tore multiple ligaments in his knee, required, I think it was 2 surgeries in 3 month span. Like he's really on, it was a tough injury. And honestly, at this point in his career, when he's 28, it's really tough to consider him coming back to full strength. But I think they did something that was really unique in the deal. And honestly, it was kind of nice for the Browns to do that. But based on the age, based on the injury situation, they actually could have cut him relatively easily. The reason they could have cut him is they had $0 he had $0 guaranteed in his contract, so they could have cut him free. Like they wouldn't have had any sort of impact. But now in this new restructure deal, he has, I think it was like $2 to $6.25 million. It's an unknown number, but it's somewhere between there of guaranteed dollars this year in the deal. And so the reason they did that was twofold. They wanted they wanted a low cap hit, but they also wanted to give Nick Chubb time to recover. They felt that if they continued with this really low guarantee, they were going to have a Nick Chubb who was just way too hungry to get on the field and potentially re-injure himself or have like a rehab setback. They know in the player that they have, they really did not want him to do that. So that's why, at least it's being reported, that that's the reason why they gave him like a $2 million plus guarantee for this season. And so because of all that, because of the language surrounding this deal, I think we need to start to take some NFL nuggets from what the Browns are telling us. Because it does seem like they just wouldn't have done this unless it was for Nick Chubb, who they just love him in the building. But this does tell me that they are prepared for him to not be fully healthy to begin the season. It's all speculation at this point. We got to keep an eye on it. But I would not be surprised if he started the year on the PUP based on the significance of his injury. And again, based on the significance of his injury, his age, I doubt we're going to see the Nick Chubb before injury this coming season. I think that we're at least another year away from seeing that. And again, then at that point, you're at 29. So where are you at in just your running back life with all the carries you've seen in your career? It is pretty clear, like last year was not his last game with the Browns, But I do think people who are going to be depending on him as like their lead running back in like a hero or zero running back strategy, I think that's just crazy. I think that his ADP should be nowhere near the top 4 rounds. I've seen some people taking him pretty high, and I think that needs to stop. I love Nick Chubb. I just think that to assume he's going to make it back from tearing multiple ligaments in his knee for the second time in his career, where he's had a pretty gruesome leg injury, it's a tough sell. So I do think we need to just temper our expectations as it relates to Nick Chubb. Okay. Oh, and another thing, would not be surprised if they drafted a running back. Wouldn't be surprised if it's a day 3 pick, but having this version of Nick Chubb, who may not even be on the field at the beginning of the season. Jerome Ford is solid. Deontay Foreman is solid, but I would not be surprised if they added a younger back who they feel could be their future if he were to pop off. So keep an eye on that as their draft comes up within the next 2 weeks. All right, we're cruising today. All right, so a few other stories I'm going to just touch on really quickly. I'm about to knock the mic over. A few other stories I'm going to touch on really quick. All right, so T. Higgins said, I do anticipate playing for the Bengals in 2024. That literally just came out right before this recording. And that's, at least it's relatively significant news. That was another player where the trade rumors are really hot and heavy, and they obviously could still happen. But the fact that he is coming out and saying this himself is at least a good sign that he's going to likely re-sign with the Bengals. Or not re-sign, he's already been franchise tagged, but he's likely going to stay with the Bengals and play for them this year and not hold out. The rubber will meet the road, obviously, in training camp, but it does seem like things are heading in the direction of him just playing for the Bengals this season. He requested a trade in mid-March, so this is why it's nice if you're a Bengals fan to think that he's going to come back and play for you. And I definitely think, like, I wouldn't be surprised if this deal gets done. And that's the thing about like these NFL contracts. We always want something super crazy and exciting to happen. A lot of times the guy will just re-sign with the same team, or just the most boring outcome will happen. So like a Brandon Aiyuk, I think he's going to re-sign with the 49ers. I wouldn't be surprised if they got a deal done with Higgins before the season started, because they got to figure out something now, because next year it is all about Jamar Chase, right? Like, he's going to be coming up on his deal. They are going to lock him in. And I wouldn't be surprised they locked him in really quick, because you can't let a player like that ever get on the open market. You just can't do it. And so, because I do think that T. Higgins is going to play for the Bengals, I've been kind of like slow playing my rankings for Chase for this reason. I do think that definitely dings Jamar Chase. I think if T. Higgins was out of the door, you could argue that he is like wide receiver 1 or 2 this year in fantasy, in PPR, any format. But because it does seem that T. Higgins is going to re-sign, I'm going to have to drop him a little bit lower. So, I mean, he's already behind CeeDee Lamb and Hill for me, but I'll probably still keep him below Justin Jefferson, depending on Jefferson's deal and depending on what happens in the draft for the Vikings. So a lot of things still in flux, but definitely I think Jamar Chase takes like an overall hit if T. Higgins is going to play this year. All right. Quick other notes before we get out of here, guys. It's been a decently long show. Joe Burrow said that his recovery is going well, especially as it relates to the wrist injury that he suffered last year. He said, I'm confident. I put in all the work I need to make sure I'm healthy for next season. So I do think Joe Burrow is going to be good to go. Like I mentioned, his fantasy status will be definitely impacted if they keep T. Higgins, or if T. Higgins plays for them this season or not. But I do expect T. Higgins to be there, so that's a boost for his value. Devonte Smith reports that there are reports from ESPN that the ball is rolling on a contract extension for Smith. So that's great for Jalen Hurts and that's great for that offense. And then lastly, Tua confirmed that he has no plans on skipping voluntary OTAs amidst the long-term negotiations with the Dolphins. And so no matter what anyone thinks, I get it. You may not think that Tua's the best. You get a quarterback of that caliber, you re-sign him. It's just going to happen. They don't ever hit the open market. That just doesn't happen. So, Dolphins fans, you're stuck with Tua, but I think you could be stuck with much worse options. You just let that man, he needs to be practicing in Antarctica to prepare for the playoffs, because that seems to be the only issue with him. Obviously, health is one, but him being able to make a big play and do what he needs to do in these cold weather late season games and playoffs seem to be the thing that is just gets him stuck up. So you're going to have your quarterback for a long time, and I think that's a good move for the Dolphins. And from a fantasy perspective, Tyreek Hill, like I mentioned, he's a top 2 wide receiver, maybe 1 if CeeDee holds out. And then Jalen Waddle, I'm expecting a bounce back. Those running backs are always a big part of the passing game. I really love the Jonnu Smith move at tight end. I think that's going to help the entire offense. And they were able to keep Teron Armstead, which is a massive deal for that offense, because when Armstead is not there, you really see the entire offense fall off a cliff. So Dolphins are definitely, they may be leader in the division right now with what's happening with the Bills. And I do think Tua, they're going to get a deal done before the season, so I wouldn't worry about that. So thank you guys so much for hopping on the show. Again, before you get out of here, make sure you subscribe to this channel and make sure you guys are tuned in for all the stuff we have. I say this every week. If you have any questions around any topic relating to football, fantasy football, we guaranteed have a show that addresses that issue. Trade talk, dynasty talk, like anything under the sun, news, clearly. Like, we're talking about this 24/7, 365. So make sure you guys are tapped in on this channel. Make sure you guys are tapped in on all of our socials. And I'll see you guys next week. Take care.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.